Bosses are awesome. For a lot of games, they're the most memorable part of the whole experience. They're the end goal you work towards and the ultimate tests of the skills you've learned up to that point. Oftentimes they tie into the story of the game and can be important characters in the lore of the world, or sometimes they're just there because they're cool. It's a concept almost as old as video games themselves. Despite bosses being so woven into the lexicon of games, they're not universal. A lot of games don't have any bosses at all, or have other methods of segmenting gameplay. I want to talk about the history of bosses, the role they play, and why they're one of my favorite parts of any video game. Back in the Stone Age of games, they simply didn't have the technology to put narratives into games, and games were barely even complex enough to have more than one screen. Games like Asteroids and Centipede were one single repeating screen where you played until you ran out of quarters. Games in this era worked a lot more like traditional games or board games. They weren't meant to be epic stories or last for 40 plus hours. They were usually about a single, simple gameplay loop where there was a winner after a short period of time. They were oftentimes competitions either against another player or to simply achieve a high score. However, this concept wasn't completely lost on games as a whole because of a little game called Dungeons & Dragons. Enemies throughout the game were given different ratings to show how strong they were. In older versions of D&D, the enemies were given levels, but in 3rd edition they also added the challenge rating, which was meant to signify how easy an encounter would be for a party depending on their average level. The standard goblin or kobold isn't a particularly notable encounter. DMs would probably throw dozens, if not hundreds of these enemies at their players. But the Tarrasque? Not so much. Modules would use higher level enemies to act as end encounters for story sections, or to be the climax to a grand campaign. This kind of design spilled over into computer games like Akalabeth, which started life as computer versions of the creator's personal Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. It doesn't just apply to RPGs though. Bosses served as the main antagonists throughout the 8 and 16-bit era. Even games like the original Super Mario Bros. Had encounters against Bowser at the end of every world. The Mega Man series fully embraced the concept and revolved the entire design of the game around their boss encounters and made them an integral part of the game mechanics, and Metroid used them as gates to the end of the game. Many generations of consoles came and went, and after a while there was a period of gaming when bosses stopped being fashionable, especially in Western games. Around the mid-2000s, technology started allowing games to be more cinematic and tell more elaborate stories. Games had always been telling stories, and some had had cinematic aspirations, but they had never been able to do it in the way they were able to by the time of the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. We saw new kinds of games come out which streamlined the story by mostly ditching bosses in favor of big narrative set pieces. Games like Heavy Rain streamlined the experience even further by ditching something else: gameplay. Heavy Rain was essentially the video game version of choose-your-own-adventure books. You had no direct control over the action sequences, instead having to press certain buttons in time with when they popped up on screen. The prevailing idea of game design at the time was that a player should be able to finish the game that they buy, and bosses were a roadblock to that philosophy. They were gatekeepers to the experience of video games. In the more cinematic era, you don't want something that would prevent the player from progressing through the rest of the story. If you were watching a movie, you wouldn't want someone pausing it every 30 minutes and not letting you continue until you could answer a 10-question worksheet first. This kind of design wasn't totally universal though, and there were plenty of games that were still using bosses as part of their gameplay loop, but the game that really brought bosses back into popularity was Dark Souls. At the risk of committing the unspeakable crime of talking about Dark Souls, I want to talk about why Dark Souls bosses were so unique for the time. The Souls games are notorious for their difficulty, but difficult bosses alone do not make them memorable or interesting. You could make a boss encounter for a game that has millions of hit points and takes hours to whittle down, but that doesn't make it fun or engaging. However, Souls does something very unique with them. Dark Souls intentionally segments the bosses from the rest of the enemies in the game through the fog gates. You can't accidentally stumble into a boss room the same way you can in games like Symphony of the Night. These are meant to tell you that the room you're entering and the enemy you're about to face are special from everything else you've been facing in the world, and they stand as a contrast to the rest of Dark Souls' seamless interconnectivity. Souls also has the iconic boss health bar at the bottom of the screen, along with the boss's name. These fights are so dramatic because not only do you get to see the health bar to track your progress through the fight, but you also see the name of the enemy you're facing. Instead of just being big enemies you're meant to beat up for experience points, they're living creatures in the world. It's something that makes the fights feel a lot more special. You enter each room feeling like your skills are going to be truly tested. The game is no longer about exploration and navigation, it becomes about survival. This kind of framing really shows the power of the boss fight, and it's a big reason why bosses have started to swing back into favor in games, especially in the indie scene. Games like Hollow Knight and Blasphemous revel in this. Whereas games like Uncharted would end chapters with big action sequences, these games make the bosses themselves the action sequence. It's an older school design philosophy that asks the player to meet it halfway, and takes advantage of something that only an interactive medium can do: force audience participation. When talking about bosses, we first have to ask ourselves, what makes a boss fight good? In my opinion, there are 3 key factors that make bosses memorable, which are aesthetics, challenge, and uniqueness. Aesthetics is a pretty self-explanatory one. Is the boss visually distinct from other enemies in the game? Does this boss convey on sight that they are something above the typical skill level? If a boss is just a reskin or a slight variation on a standard enemy, it loses a lot of payoff and stops being threatening. Most of the time, games accomplish this by making the boss significantly larger than standard enemies or your character. The sense of scale helps to show that what you're about to fight is much more capable of giving you the business than what you'd been previously fighting. Challenge doesn't necessarily mean the fight has to be hard, but rather it has to be something above the usual encounter. In Castlevania, the average skeleton isn't going to deal much damage to you and is probably going to go down in a single hit. If the boss doesn't present that much more resistance than a typical enemy, it's a pretty underwhelming boss. The game needs to increase the resistance against the player to make the fight feel rewarding and not like a waste of time. The last factor, uniqueness, is, in my opinion, probably the most important aspect of what makes a good boss. Ideally, a boss should make you do or think about something you don't normally think about in an average encounter. If the boss doesn't challenge your knowledge of the systems of the game, then it feels like nothing more than a big punching bag. Examples of this are things like needing to use Reflect on your whole team to survive Bahamut's attacks in Final Fantasy IV, needing to take out the archers when fighting the Tower Knight in Demon's Souls, or needing to use the second controller port when fighting Psycho Mantis. These are so memorable because they ask you to use tools, skills, and strategies you wouldn't normally use in a typical fight. These are mostly guidelines, as there are plenty of exceptions to them. Some bosses can be effective purely on spectacle alone, and some bosses check all 3 of these boxes but don't do them in particularly fun ways. The boss encounter is a very tricky thing to pull off effectively, but when it's done right, they're the parts of the game that people talk about after they're done playing. With indie games and more old-school experiences becoming easier to develop and publish, we're living in a renaissance for bosses. I wanted to talk about a few of my favorites in recent years and how I think they do bosses especially well. You can't really talk about bosses without talking about the Souls series and games that have been inspired by them. The Souls games didn't design bosses to be a part of the experience, they designed the experience around the bosses. The lore created these larger-than-life figures that have shaped the creation of the landscape of the world you're living in, and you're just the guy to go and smack them around. By contextualizing the bosses as important parts of a much bigger story that you just happen to be in, it adds a lot more gravity to the fight than if it were just another scary monster. Hollow Knight and Blasphemous are also great examples of this kind of design. These games feel like they designed a world with important characters and cool bosses, and then built the game around these encounters. Cuphead encompasses the purest form of this idea. A lot of old school games had a mode called the Boss Rush, where you would just fight bosses in a row after each other. The designers of Cuphead said, instead of putting in a Boss Rush mode, what if the whole game was the Boss Rush mode? The game still has platforming and world exploration, but they act almost entirely as ways to get currency to purchase upgrades that you use during the boss fights. The map you traverse isn't an obstacle, but it's essentially a more elaborate version of the stage select screen from Mega Man games. The focus isn't on platforming chops or level design, but instead on the single instances. Shadow of the Colossus does something very similar, but the space between the bosses is much more developed and encourages exploration. Final Fantasy VII Remake had to reimagine and redo all of its boss fights. The bosses in the game check almost every criteria I mentioned and stand out as one of the biggest showcases of the game's strengths, even more so than they were in the PS1 game. The game even gives you VR missions to take on optional bosses and rewards you with extra summons. They added bosses to expanded areas that didn't have them initially and turned some of the more esoteric enemies from the original into their own fights. Slay the Spire and Enter the Gungeon are both interesting cases where the bosses themselves are not only fun and memorable, but they exist in a procedurally generated environment. The levels and the order in which you face bosses is completely randomized each time you play. Slay the Spire takes this a step further by randomizing every individual combat and also introducing mini-bosses in every stage that reward you with artifacts if you can beat them. Getting to the end of every phase in the Spire is the same sensation of opening a pack of magic cards and flipping through to see what rare you got. Slay the Spire shows you what boss is at the end of each phase though, so I guess it's kind of like drafting magic, flipping straight to the rare, realizing it's a bulk rare that's not in your colors, then passing it to someone who will almost certainly kill you with it in the second round. Bosses are an important part of the gaming ecosystem, and it's great that they're back in fashion. We still have games like The Last of Us Part 2, Uncharted 4, and Detroit Become Human that are delivering different kinds of experiences, but games like God of War, Final Fantasy VII Remake, and Sekiro are proving that these kinds of encounters don't have to just live in the past or the realm of indie development. They're the big payoff at the end of every area, and there's very few things more satisfying than finally beating that super hard final encounter and knowing that you're the one that overcame that challenge after 2 hours of not being good at shield parrying. But even though it took 2 hours of getting pummeled into the dirt, it makes overcoming those odds all the more satisfying.